Hello and welcome to the 2021 State of Medical Device Virtual Summit. This session is on the FDA's 510K modernization. What, if anything, has changed, is changing, and will change? My name is Wade Schrader. I am a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker, Mike Drues, and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is about 45 minutes long and includes a Q&A session at the end. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of those questions as time permits. This entire session will be recorded, and the slides are available to you to download on the right-hand side under the handout section. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. Our mission is to improve the quality of life. Anything we can do as an organization that helps you bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. Whether that's through hosting free training sessions, partnering with world-class consultants like Mike Drues, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies around the world are moving away from paper-based, general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today and a distinguished partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drues. Mike Drues, Ph.D., is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Dr. Drues received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees in biomedical engineering from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. He has worked for and consulted with leading medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies ranging in size from startups to Fortune 100 companies. He also works on a regular basis for the FDA, Health Canada, the US and European patent offices, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. So, without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Mike Drues.
Thank you, Wade, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank you and all of my other friends at Greenlight.guru for the opportunity to participate in this conference and share this presentation today on FDA's 510K modernization. Just two things I would like to very quickly emphasize about my background before continuing on. First of all, as Wade said, in addition to working as a consultant for a wide variety of medical technology companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and some of the other regulatory bodies around the world. And quite frankly, the reason why I wanted to mention that is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. The second thing I wanted to just reiterate about my background is I'm a contributing editor to several of the very large medical technology and regulatory publications in the world. I'm constantly putting out a lot of columns and webinars and podcasts on a variety of different topics through organizations like Greenlight Guru, and you can see some of the other groups that I work with here. So I would encourage you to check out my stuff, and you might find it valuable. All right, so let's get right into the subject matter of today's presentation, and that is 510K modernization. What exactly is 510K modernization? And more importantly, do we need it? Why do we need it? Do we need it now? And so on and so on. So this is obviously something that's been brewing for quite a while, but most recently, FDA made some announcements in the last couple of years. Here's a press release from their website. FDA continues to take steps to fulfill its commitment to strengthen and modernize emphasize the word modernize here, the 510K medical device program. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But just a couple reminders, when was the 510K created? It was actually created in 1976. I suspect probably before some, maybe many of the people in this audience were even born. And I find it a bit ironic and perhaps a bit scary that almost 50 years later, we're still trying to figure all this out. You know, the 510K is clearly the workhorse of the medical device industry here in the United States. But as we'll discuss, it's by no means a perfect program, and yet it's been around for almost a half a century. What has changed since Congress created the 510K in 1976? Well, the short answer is, quite frankly, absolutely nothing. Not one word, not one punctuation mark in the actual regulation has changed since the 510K was created in 1976. Yes, there has been guidance that has come out, a litany of guidance over the almost half century. But after all, guidance is not regulation. Guidance is only guidance. But the regulation itself has not changed. There are a number of things that have been proposed to be changed, and we'll talk about a few of them today. But the regulation itself has not changed for nearly 50 years. And so finally, why is the 510K being modernized? And I put that word in air quotes now. Well, there are a couple of root causes to this problem, as we'll discuss. As an engineer myself, my Ph.D. is in biomedical engineering. Engineers like to think in terms of root causes. One of the root causes, as we'll talk about, is to make the program safer. But the other is politics, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. I find it fascinating that so many people, they try to separate regulation from politics, when to me that makes absolutely no sense. Why? Because where does the regulation come from? It comes from the politicians. So to separate regulation and politics, in my opinion, makes absolutely no sense. But most importantly, here's something that a lot of people either have forgotten or perhaps never know to begin with, and that is, when the 510K was created by Congress back in 1976, it was considered to be meant as an exception, in essence, a loophole, as David Kessler, one of the former commissioners at FDA and one of my former bosses in FDA, liked to characterize it. And over the last almost half century, the exception became the rule. The exception became the rule. So in other words, today, as everybody knows, the vast majority of devices, medical devices here in the United States, come onto the market under the 510K. But 50 years ago, that was never Congress's intent. The purpose of the 510K was meant to be an exception rather than the rule. And interestingly enough, Dr. Kessler goes on to say that the vast majority of medical devices today, regrettably, this is his word, not mine, regrettably are regulated under this framework. I wanted to start out with this quote because this is one of the former commissioners of the FDA saying this. Of course, one would like to think that, you know, people like Dr. Kessler, and I have a lot of respect for Dr. Kessler. He and I agree on a number of things, certainly not everything, but a number of things. Why aren't they saying these things when they're in the agency as opposed to after they leave the agency? That's something to think about. Again, could it be politics? Of course not. That could not be part of any of this discussion today. And of course, there's been a lot of, shall we say, not so favorable press around the medical device industry in general, and the 510K in particular. There's perhaps no better example than the Netflix documentary that came out about 2 years ago now, called The Bleeding Edge. If you haven't seen The Bleeding Edge, I strongly recommend watching it. I think it should be a mandatory watch for everybody working in the medical device industry. But for those of you that have not seen it, let me just share with you the trailer so we can talk about it a little bit.
Have you ever had any surgeries? I had a medical device that broke, leaving fragments everywhere. It set off a connective tissue disorder that started deteriorating my joints. Holy crap. Yeah. Hard, but that's like...
Medical devices are everywhere.
It's pretty amazing. Tongue depressor.
Prosthetic limb.
Implants. Pacemakers.
Because it's everywhere, we have to be careful.
There's this hunger to have the newest technology. New equates to unproven.
I thought it was simple, and it all made sense. costs $25 to bring to market, and they sell for $2,000 a pop.
It's a very profitable part of the healthcare system.
Companies' new products may not be safer than other products on the market, but they will promote them to drive up their profits.
What they did was willfully ignore the risks that they were putting these people to without telling them.
After my
So I think for time, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there. You get the idea. But simply put, we cannot have an intelligent conversation about 510K modernization without trying to understand the problems that led us to where we are today. Simply put, to anybody that thinks that the 510K program is a perfect program is just naive. It's a pretty good program. And I don't believe, as the Institute of Medicine came out several years ago with their recommendation of throwing the entire 510K in the trash, that would be truly like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But to say that the 510K is a perfect program, I just think is simply naive. And one other thing that I just wanted to mention real quick along the lines of bleeding edge is the implant files, which came out about a year and a half ago. This was sort of an international analysis of medical devices in the medical device industry. I'm just pointing this out very quickly for those of you that are not familiar with these things. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. These kinds of reports go back over many decades. You need to educate yourself to try to understand where we are today in order to better understand where we're moving in the future. So let's go back to what I started to describe a moment ago as the root cause of the 510K modernization. Why is it that we're doing this? Well, as I hinted at a moment ago, I think portion of it is politics, let's be honest. And here's an example of that. 2 years ago, CDRH came out and said one of their goals is to have 50% of quote-unquote novel devices, I'll talk more about that in a moment, 50% of novel devices come to the market in the U.S. first, or at the very least in parallel with other major markets. I have a number of devices in the PDP program right now, and I get frequently asked by the FDA, are we planning on bringing these breakthrough technologies onto the market first here in the U.S., or if not, why not, and so on. So this is clearly a goal, a political goal of CDRH. Not that there's anything wrong with this, but we have to acknowledge that this is in fact the case. When you look at what these new and novel devices are, here are some statistics out of FDA. I find it interesting that they're recategorizing how they consider, how they count new and novel devices to kind of get the numbers up a little bit higher. But let's start out with the next question, and that is, what does novel really mean? You know, I hear a lot of people, they tell me they're working on a new or novel device, and after describing it to me for about 30 seconds, I quickly realized that this ain't new or novel. So a number of years ago, I developed a litmus test, and I put it in one of my columns. If you think you're working on something new or novel, ask yourself the following 3 questions. Is there regulation on this? Is there guidance on this? Is there reimbursement for this? I'll say that one more time. If you think you're working on something new or novel, ask yourself 3 questions. Is there regulation on it? Is there guidance on it? Is there reimbursement for it? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, I hate to burst your bubble, but you ain't working on anything new or novel. Because to me, you know, one of the criteria of new and novel means that nobody has done it before. And FDA goes on to imply here that just because something is a PMA or possibly an HDE necessarily means that it's novel. I don't think so. I think there are a heck of a lot of PMA devices that are Me Too's. Think about the example of the bare metal coronary stent. I'm not even talking about drug-eluting stents. I'm talking about simple bare metal coronary stents. There are dozens and dozens of them on the market. They are all PMA, but they are all, I'll use the phrase, substantially equivalent. Not in the context of the 510K sense of the word, but in the sense that they're still Me Too's. So just because something is a PMA or an HDE doesn't necessarily mean that it's novel. By the way, just because something is a de novo doesn't necessarily mean that it's novel. So something to think about. Can a 510K device be novel if it's substantially equivalent to something else? You know, some people would argue that putting 510K and novel in the same sentence is an oxymoron to begin with, right? Because how can something be new and novel and yet be substantially equivalent or basically the same as something that already exists? So there is a bit of irony, perhaps even hypocrisy there. And finally, what does breakthrough 510K mean? Some people might even say that use the phrase breakthrough 510K, that's an oxymoron. Because once again, how can it be a breakthrough if it's similar to something that already exists? Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I mentioned a moment ago that I have probably about 8 or maybe even 9 medical devices in the BDP program right now. A couple of them are being brought onto the market under the 510K. A few years ago, Congress did relax the regulation, include 510Ks as part of the BDP program. Whether they should have or not, that's a different story, but they did. So the question is, how can you argue that something is breakthrough and yet substantially equivalent at the same time? Well, it can be done. And for those of you that are interested, I did a webinar for Greenlight, I think about 2 years ago on the breakthrough program where I talk about that in much more detail. So in terms of taking this a step further, one of the most common questions that I get from people and companies all the time is, what's the quickest, easiest, fastest, cheapest way to get my medical device onto the market? In other words, what's the pathway that would give me the lowest regulatory burden? Well, my advice is very, very simple. From a regulatory perspective, design your device, and what I mean by that is both in terms of the labeling as well as the technology, design your device to be as similar as you can, identical would be best, to your predicate. Design your device to be as similar as you can to be as possible to your predicate. Now, from a regulatory perspective, that is the spot on, quote unquote, correct advice to give. But if I were to put my professional biomedical engineer hat on, I hope that some of you in the audience would appreciate that when I give that kind of advice, that causes my blood pressure to just shoot through the roof. Why? Because we're essentially creating an incentive for companies to copy what other companies have already done by creating, Me Too products. Is this the academic equivalent of plagiarism? Of course it is. How could anybody dispute that it is? But it is the reality. But I'll take that a step further, because it's not sufficient to just simply identify the problems that we have today. We also have to come up with potential solutions so that we can discuss them and implement them and ultimately try to make the world a better place. So what's the alternative? We can consider a de novo. A de novo is similar to a 510K in that it's also for class 2 or lower devices. But the difference is where there is nothing that's substantially equivalent. In other words, if your device is not similar in labeling or technology or both to an existing device, you should consider the de novo. And again, for those that are interested in the de novo, I did a webinar for Greenlight, a deep dive into the de novo. I've probably got as much, maybe even more experience doing de novos as almost anybody else, because quite frankly, there aren't that many of them compared to the 510K. But most importantly, here's the thing to remember. Please don't use regulation or the FDA as an excuse to hold us back. There's too much of that going on. I run into too many companies, too many people in those companies who say, oh yeah, we have a really cool technology, or coming from Boston, what I would call a wicked cool technology, but FDA is making it too difficult. The regulation is too burdensome. We can't do it. I think that's just a convenient excuse. It's up to us to figure out how to work with the FDA to get the best products onto the market as we can. And for those of you that are interested in more information on the de novo, I would point you to this cover story article that I wrote for the Journal of Medical Device Regulation several years ago. The reason why I bring it up here is because this is not a freebie. You have to subscribe to the publication to get it. But if you send me an email requesting this, I would be happy to, as a matter of professional courtesy, send you a copy of the article. So most of the other resources that I reference, for example, the Greenlight webinars and podcasts and other sources, that's totally free. You don't need, anything to get them. But some of them, like this particular publication, if you want a copy of it, send me an email. I'd be happy to send it to you. So in terms of 510K modernization, let's be honest. Does the 510K encourage innovation or Me Too's? I think the short answer is yes. I think it would be very difficult for anybody to argue that we have not created incentives for companies to basically bring out products that we already have. Now, to be fair, this is not unique in the medical device world. We find exactly the same thing in the drug world as well. Here's an interesting statistic for you from the drug side of the universe. only about 20% of the quote unquote new drugs that FDA approves in any calendar year, only about 20% of them are in fact new, what we call NMEs, new molecular entities. 80%, on the other hand, are Me Too's. So again, this is not unique to medical devices. We find the same challenges in the drug world as well. It's about time that we get past them. So let's take a deeper dive into this topic of 510K modernization. My friend John Spear at Greenlight and I did a podcast on this a while ago, and I thought I would just share with you some of the highlights from that podcast. First of all, as I said, the root cause of this whole FDA modernization discussions that we're having is twofold. First, the news of devices is not always favorable. I talked about the bleeding edge a moment ago. And second of all, FDA wants manufacturers to develop newer and better technologies than what's currently available. And by the way, why should that just be FDA's goal? Shouldn't that be our goal in industry as well? But think about it. If we want to encourage new and better technologies, is the 510K the best way to do that? Should the word better even be part of the 510K, or is that in fact an oxymoron? You know, here's an interesting thing to consider. When we're bringing a device through the FDA as a 510K, do we want to say that it's better than what we already have? Absolutely not. This would in fact be the kiss of death. We want to say that it's basically the same, i.e. it's substantially equivalent to what we already have. However, once you get it through the FDA and are selling it on the market, do your sales and marketing people want to say that it's the same as what we already have? Of course not. They want to say that it's better. So how can something be the same and yet better at the same time? I have no idea, but we've been playing this game since 1976. One of the potential solutions, and I'll put the word solution here in air quotes, that some people have proposed in the last few years is the so-called 10-year predicate rule to eliminate or to reduce the problem of predicate creep. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But in a nutshell, that rule would say that you cannot use a predicate for a 510K if the predicate was cleared more than 10 years ago. The question is, will this solve our problems, or in fact, will it create more problems than it solves? For what it's worth, I'm tremendously against the 10-year predicate rule. I think that's a terrible reason, or terrible idea for a whole bunch of different reasons. And again, I'll talk more about that in a moment. But bottom line, I think if it's implemented, and it has not been implemented yet, and I hope that it isn't implemented. People are talking about it, but it has not been implemented. It's going to actually create more problems than it's going to solve. So let's dig into this a little bit further. The 510K 101 to me, obviously a successful 510K needs a predicate, but since 1976, there has been no limitation on the age of the predicate. In other words, that predicate could have been cleared a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago. It makes no difference. Now, everything else being equal, I would prefer to use the more recent predicate as opposed to an older one. But if it's to my advantage to use an older predicate, I will definitely do that. But here's how I mitigate the risk of having a problem. For those of you that have heard me talk before, I'm a huge fan of the pre-submission process, or the pre-sub. So when I go to the FDA with my pre-sub and I talk about, here's my device, this is what it does, this is how it works, I'm going to bring it onto the market as a 510K, and here are all the reasons why. Here's the predicate that I'm going to be using, and here are the reasons why. And oh, by the way, this predicate was cleared 25 years ago. Now, you might know that there are other predicates that have been cleared more recently. Before I tell you why I'm using the 25-year-old predicate, let me first tell you why I'm not using the more recent predicates. In other words, one of the things that differentiates my approach to this game compared to so many others, I don't justify what I do. I also justify what I don't do as well. And that's an important lesson to be learned. So I don't justify what you do, but justify what you don't do. If a new device increases or creates new risks than the predicate, it can't be used as a 510K. That has been what the regulation has said since 1976, but as we'll talk about in a couple more minutes, that has never been taken that literally. And again, I'll talk more about that in a moment. Another reason why I'm not crazy about the 10-year predicate rule is because only about 20% of 510Ks reference a predicate that was more than 10 years old, which means that 80% of them reference predicates that were less than 10 years old. So they wouldn't be addressing the predicate creep problem. So is this a good solution? Something to think about. And finally, there's been past movements for alternatives and abbreviated 510Ks. This is going to lead us to the quote-unquote recently created safety and performance-based 510K, which is another part of 510K modernization. In my opinion, the safety and performance-based 510K, or the SP 510K, is just nothing more than a resurrection of the abbreviated 510K. They are really the same thing. So a quick recap in terms of the types of 510Ks, as most in the audience know, we have traditional, we have special, we have abbreviated. These have been around for a very long time. The traditional has been around since 1976. The others were created as part of the quote-unquote new 510K paradigm, which is now 20 years old, interestingly enough. So every time I hear this phrase 510K modernization, I just have to kind of laugh. Beyond these types of 510Ks, do we need anything else? Well, I mentioned a moment ago the safety and performance-based 510K. It was created just 2 years ago in 2018. One of the things that Scott Gottlieb announced as former FDA commissioner before before leaving the agency. But as I said, it's really nothing more than an updated version, if you will, of the abbreviated 510K. And for those of you that are interested, I've done a couple of webinars for Greenlight on the 510K where I go into the safety and performance-based 510K in much more detail. One other thing that I'll mention as part of FDA modernization, which I don't hear many people talking about, there are other forms of 510Ks that we really need. One of them is the so-called catch-up 510K. We talked a bit about predicate creep a moment ago. I'll talk about change creep. One of the problems that faces the medical device industry is we have an existing device on the market. We make a change to it. We don't notify the FDA because we do it under a letter to file. We make another change. We don't notify the FDA. We do it as a letter to file. We make a third change, and so on and so on. Each of those changes individually might not be very significant, but when you add up all of those changes together, at a certain point over time, they are going to become significant. We have no formal mechanism that we can take the aggregate of those changes to the FDA and give it to them as an update. But again, as I said a moment ago, I refuse to use regulation as an excuse to hold me back. So when I want to do a catch-up 510K, first of all, I will never call it a catch-up 510K because there is no such thing in the regulatory world. But what I'll essentially do is I'll do a special 510K, and I'll make one of the changes in that special 510K sort of the primary goal of that 510K, and then along with it, I will incorporate all of those other changes that I've made to my device under the previous letter to files. So is it a good solution or a clean solution to this problem? Absolutely not. But in the absence of something better, in the absence of having something like a catch-up 510K, it's the best solution that I can think of, and I've done it many times. If any of you have a better solution, please do share it with me. So the safety and performance-based 510K, technically part of this 510K modernization, but as I said, it's really nothing more than an updated version, a reincarnation, if you will, of the abbreviated 510K that was created almost 20 years ago in 1998. So is the safety and performance-based 510K substantially equivalent to an abbreviated 510K? Pun definitely intended. So more importantly, should not all submissions be safety and performance-based? One would like to think. So again, is there really anything new here? I'm going to skip this one. Just a couple more things, and then we'll wrap this up and take a few comments or questions. Do we need more regulation, or do we need to better understand and apply the regulation that we already have? There are two most important components of the 510K. The first one, and they are substantial equivalence and risk mitigation. Bottom line, I don't care if you fill out all the forms properly. I don't care if you dot all your I's and cross all your T's. That is not what this game is about. Unless you have a rock-solid substantial equivalence argument, unless you have a bulletproof risk mitigation strategy, your 510K is not going to be cleared. Certainly not first time out of the box. Let me explain it this way. There are many medical devices that have come onto the market in the past, say 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. If the same device came to the FDA today with the same submission, it might not get through. The question is why? What has changed? Has the regulation changed? No, as I said earlier, in my opinion, not in my opinion, it's factually correct. According to the CFR, the regulation for the 510K has not changed since it was created in 1976. But what has changed quite a bit, and what will continue to change in the coming years, is the level of scrutiny, if you will, that FDA is applying to certain parts of the submission. In my opinion, the two most important ones are substantial equivalence and risk mitigation. For those that are interested, I've done deep dives into both of those topics in separate webinars with Greenlight, one on the 510K and substantial equivalence, the second on risk mitigation. So I would encourage you to take a look at those if you're interested. Getting into it a little bit more detail, what goes into a successful 510K? Is there a governing equation of the 510K? Well, coming from as an engineer, I like to think analytical. So there's two fundamental equations of the 510K. First of all, the 510K is based on substantial equivalence and risk. And then the second is substantial equivalence is equal to labeling and technology. So if we substitute equation 2 into equation 1, we get what I call the governing equation of the 510K. Basically, a successful 510K means you have to solve this equation, labeling, technology, and risk. Quite simply, if you have a valid and defensible solution to that equation in red, then you will likely have a successful 510K. On the other hand, if there's no solution, or if it's an invalid or an indefensible solution, then you're probably not going to be having a successful 510K. You should be considering the de novo or possibly even the PMA. In other words, don't focus on what the regulation says. Although that's important, that's the basic part. Focus instead on understanding what I call the regulatory logic. In other words, the thinking process, which is infinitely more important than the regulation itself. Infinitely more important. And I wish I had more time to share more examples of that. So remember, regulation is about two things. Regulation is all about the interpretation of words. That's part number one. And part number two, our ability to defend our interpretation. And I find it fascinating how so many people seem to assume that the way FDA reads and understands and interprets a certain set of words is the only way or the best way. I do not make such an assumption. If I agree with the way FDA is interpreting a certain set of words, then great, end of discussion. Don't let the door hit you in the you-know-what on the way out. On the other hand, if I disagree in the way FDA interprets those same words, it's my job to go into the FDA and convince them otherwise. It's not their job to convince me. It's my job to convince them. The burden of proof is on me. And fortunately for me, I'm successful more often than I'm not. I'm not successful 100% of the time, but I am successful more often than not. What happens when you get substantial equivalence wrong? Usually nothing good. And by the way, if you get a non-substantially equivalent response from FDA, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not substantially equivalent. I find it fascinating how so many people think that if FDA says your device is NSE, that means it is in fact NSE. That's not the case. It could very well be that you just didn't prove to the FDA that it's not substantially equivalent. It's kind of like not guilty does not necessarily mean innocent. I find it fascinating how so many people think that if somebody is found not guilty in a criminal matter, that means that they're innocent. That is not what that means. So similarly with not substantially equivalent, NSE does not necessarily mean NSE. Just wanted to point that out. And by the way, an NSE determination should never, ever, ever happen, but it does a lot, including to some of the largest medical device companies on earth. And I just laugh when that happens because it's so easy to mitigate, maybe not completely eliminate, but mitigate the chances of that happening. So what's the Achilles heel of the 510K? And I'm going to wrap this up here in just very, very quickly. The short answer is predicate creep. What's predicate creep? Simply put, predicate creep is when we have in a device, we make a change to it, we do a 510K, we make another change to it, we do a 510K, and so on and so on. Suffice it to say that those individual changes measured over a short period of time might not be significant. However, when you add up all of those incremental changes over the years, over the almost 50 years that we've been playing that game, now that those changes can be significant. And this is what in the vernacular we call predicate creep. What's the solution? Well, one solution that some people have posed is the so-called 10-year predicate rule. There's so many problems with that. Just to tick off a couple. One is it's making an underlying assumption that if a device has been cleared more than 10 years ago, it's not somehow as good as or as safe as a device that was cleared, say, last year. That's absolutely not the case, at least not necessarily. There are a lot of devices that have been cleared many, many years ago. They're as good at, maybe even better than what we've cleared today. And if we were to implement this rule, we would be throwing away a tremendous wealth of real-world evidence because we couldn't use that if we wanted to bring a device onto the market that was using a predicate that was more than 10 years old. But I think the biggest reason why this is attractive to so many people, quite frankly, is it requires absolutely no thinking whatsoever. You can have an IQ of 0 and literally be able to implement the 10-year predicate rule. Why? Because it would just become a tick box on the form. In other words, imagine just adding one line to the RTA checklist. Is the predicate more than 10 years old? Yes. If so, then you fail. The FDA throws back in your face. If it's less than 10 years old, you continue on to the next point. The question is that kind of the regulation what we really want? In my opinion, absolutely not. But regrettably, some people seem to think that. So again, predicate creep, at some point, these small incremental changes are going to become significant. For those of you that have seen the movie Multiplicity, this is an example of how I often describe predicate creep. The idea is very similar. So if you want to know the truth about the 510K, for those of you that are fans of John Oliver on HBO, you might want to take a look at what he said about the 510K last year. You might find it interesting. So to wrap this up, do we need to change or modernize, if you want to call it, the 510K? The short answer is absolutely yes. And anybody, including my many friends in some of the leading industry organizations in the medical device world, who say no, they're just naive. The better question is, how do we make those changes? How do we modernize the 510K? Do we want to create more regulation by, for example, creating the safety and performance-based 510K, by imposing the 10-year predicate rule? Many people would advocate that that's the solution to this problem. Or do we want to have more people thinking and more people take responsibility for their actions? I started out in this business almost 30 years ago as an R&D engineer, before some of you were probably even born. This was back in those days. We had a heck of a lot less regulation than we have today. The design controls did not even exist back then. They were created in 1997, and yet somehow, I don't know how this happened, but somehow we were able to get reasonably safe and effective medical devices onto the market. Fast forward almost 30 years later, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of regulation. The question is, are our products any more safe and effective? Are our products any better? Is the world a better place? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but certainly something to think about. Is more regulation the solution to all of our problems? I used to teach medical school back in the day, and I was fond of saying to my med students, the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. The medical device equivalent of that is we designed the medical device perfectly and the patient died anyway. The regulatory equivalent of that is we followed the regulation perfectly. That is, we did all that FDA or Health Canada, whoever asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. Unfortunately, these things happen more frequently than some people would like to think. So to wrap this up, is it possible to think regulatory? The late, great Carl Sagan said that science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. My spin on Dr. Sagan's quote is regulatory affairs, including what we're talking about here about the 510K modernization, is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of rules and regulations, or at least it should be. If we took this approach, and this is not a common approach, but it is my approach, if we took this approach, maybe Dr. Sagan would be proud. So and this will be the last one, and then Wade, we can open this up for some Q&A in the minutes that we have remaining. Douglas MacArthur said rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying don't follow the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy, but what I am saying is this: if the rules make sense, then by all means follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, like this 10-year predicate rule, for example, if the rules don't make sense and we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but I would love to hear any thoughts from any of the people in the audience if you care to share. So at this point, I'll wrap this up and we'll save the last few minutes for some Q&A. I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I want to thank Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to be part of this conference today. And Wade, let's see what questions we have from the audience. Wade, are you there?
For a second, I got an error message. So that actually goes right along with the first question I'm going to answer here for everyone is, so thank you all for your patience with the handout download not working. We are receiving an error. So the handout of this presentation will be available on the virtual summit website later today. So you'll be able to access that there. So Mike, thank you so much for this presentation. That's really great. I watched Bleeding Edge actually from a recommendation from John Spear when I first started here at Greenlight, and I definitely recommend it as well. I really like how you hit on the point of, is it more regulation that we need, or is it more responsibility, us taking responsibility? And I think that movie hits on that well. So anyway, getting into our, yeah, absolutely. Getting into a couple of our questions here. So starting out, pretty simple one here, but does the FDA support multiple predicates approach in order to achieve a better or more advanced product?
Yeah, great question. Simply put, and this is described in a fair amount of detail in my 510K and substantial equivalence webinar through Greenlight.guru. So there is the multiple predicate strategy and there is the split predicate strategy. They are not the same. Many people think they're the same. They're not the same. Several years ago in one of the guidances, CDRH said that industry should not use the split predicate strategy as part of a 510K. I find it interesting that guidance is inherently non-binding. So how can FDA tell you not to do something in a guidance that's not binding? So CDRH's official policy is they're not fans of the split predicate strategy. Simply put, because products that have gotten onto the market in the past using the split predicate strategy that in hindsight should not have gotten onto the market. They did cause harm to people and in some cases kill people. And so CDRH's response to remove that from the toolbox. You can still use the split predicate strategy, but my advice to companies is to use it as the last resort and don't spring it in your submission. The first time that you tell them that you're going to use the split predicate strategy, if you tell them that in your 510K submission, you might as well just put a big red flag on your submission saying, don't even bother reading the rest of this, just throw it right back in my face. Take it to the FDA as a pre-sub and explain to them why you're going to use the split predicate strategy if that's the strategy that you're going to use. On the multiple predicate strategy side, the multiple predicate strategy, CDRH has never come out and said you shouldn't use, but let's be honest, most of CDRH would prefer to use a single predicate as opposed to multiple predicates. Why? Because quite frankly, it's easier. Right? It becomes more complicated when you use more than one predicate. But if it's to my advantage to use more than one predicate, I will definitely do that. I don't think we should be looking for the path of least resistance. I don't think we should be looking for the solution that doesn't cause us to think a little bit more. So, very, very simply put, if you can avoid using the split and the multiple predicate strategy and use a single predicate, that's probably going to be the cleanest, quickest, and simplest clearance. On the other hand, if it's to your advantage to use the multiple or the split predicate strategies, you should definitely do it, but take it to the FDA and convince them of that first. Does that make sense, Wade?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Appreciate that answer. And we'll try to fit one more in here. I know it is the top of the hour, so if you guys have to jump to another call or another meeting, please feel free to do that. But we will fit in one more question here. So this is with the special 510K in terms of that catch-up 510K that you mentioned. How many letters to file would you recommend before doing that special 510K is what you call the catch-up 510K?
Great question. And the reason why I ask is because so many people, they want numbers. They want to say, okay, as long as I do 3 letters to file, it's okay. But once I go to a 4th letter to file, it's not okay anymore. With all due respect to the person that asked that question, I think it's the totally wrong question that we should be asking, and that the number of letter to files really is totally irrelevant. What's much more important is the, how do you want to call it, the magnitude, the significance of those letter to files. And I'll give you just a real quick, very simple example. So if you have a device and you change the color of the exterior of the housing of the device from, say, I don't know, white to ivory or something like that, because the dirt doesn't show up as much if it's ivory as opposed to pure white, and you make that change as a letter to file, with all due respect, who cares? That doesn't make any difference. But if you're starting to make more significant changes under the letter to file, changes that may ultimately impact the safety, efficacy, performance of the device, changing the overall risk, now you're starting to get into that gray area. So I think the better question that we should be asking is not the number of letters to file, but rather at what point does the sum of those changes to our medical device become significant enough to possibly impact safety, efficacy, performance, or to possibly impact risk. In one company's situation, it might be 1 or 2 letters to file. In another company's situation, it might be 8 or 10 letters to file. It's not the number that's important. It's the magnitude of the impact. I don't know, Wade, if I'm doing a very good job of explaining that. I hope the audience understands what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that was a great explanation. And so I think that'll be good for today as far as questions, but there are a lot of good questions in here for you, Mike. So just to let everyone know, Mike will be receiving these questions and he'll be able to follow up with answers to you for these questions. So thank you all for attending today's session on the FDA's 510K modernization. Thank you, Mike, for sharing your insight with us today and answering some of these questions. Any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you and my friends at Greenlight, for the opportunity to do this. And for those of you that do have questions that didn't get a chance to ask them, please feel free to contact me directly, or if there's anything I can do to help, you have my phone and my email. I'm happy to help however I can. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And once again, thank you all for attending. Please enjoy the remainder of the virtual summit tomorrow and have a wonderful holiday season. Goodbye.